This is obviously based on the methodology that we developed over the last whatever now 8 years. So what we think we know is important is that seasonal temperature, solar radiance, photoperiod, potentially Kelvin temperature throughout the day, and then lunar cycle. The thought is that they work at a progressively finer scale to trigger the corals up to the exact night and time of that night of spawning. But this starts months and months before the actual moment of spawning. So the thought is that temperature is the first cycle that triggers the corals to start producing eggs. This is assuming that you have a healthy coral and a coral of the right age. And so what we know about most acroporids now is that they start becoming sexually mature at about 3 years old, and then obviously can live many, many years. But assuming that they're well fed, they're healthy, they haven't bleached, they haven't had disease, and they're at the right age, the seasonal temperature change going from winter into spring is that first trigger to say, right, let's start putting energy into gamete production. And then there's been a huge debate about actually whether seasonal temperature then defines the month of spawning or this. So there's been two sort of train of thoughts. Actually, temperature is the main thing that tells the coral which season to go. Another train of thought is that solar radiation is the pattern that the corals are tuned into. And really the two arguments come about, if we think about the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, what we know about the Great Barrier Reef, if you look at the inner reef to the outer reef, they're on the same solar radiation pattern. But the inner reefs are warmer by 1 month, and so they spawn 1 month earlier than the outer barrier reef. So that's why the common thought is that temperature seems to be the thing that defines the season, the month of spawning. But then there's been papers that counter argue that from the Caribbean that say solar radiation. And bear in mind, these two are obviously in collinearity. So the elliptical movement of the Earth around the sun, you're getting more photons hitting the Earth. That then is warming up the sea. And so when you graph out solar radiation and temperature, they pretty much mirror the same pattern, but you have this latent delay of a month or two where it's just taking a long time to warm the ocean. But this is ultimately the premise of what I started the whole work on, is that we know there's enough information out in the literature, and so we need to try and replicate as much of this as possible. So in essence, we think this is all important. That's the premise that we've started with. And I'll show you on another presentation where we're trying to strip this apart now and understand this interface between temperature and solar radiation a little bit better. Originally, when we started using this, we were using a GHL, but then moved over to Apex. And then, that's when I met Justin, and we put the Radions on and put a lot more sophistication on. So basically, it's a standard GHL, standard Apex with WXM wireless, connector, and then the Radions are then connected to each Apex unit. With each one, obviously the seasonal table is where all the information has been put for each of the different geographical locations that we work with. So looking at the seasonal table, we know that we can do the temperature cycle, lunar phases, and then the photoperiod by determining the sunset, sunrise times. So in essence, what we do is for the given location, I generally go to timeanddate.com for the light information, both the photoperiods and the lunar cycles. And then in terms of temperature cycles, this is just an example from a data logger that we put out on a reef in Singapore. But there's lots of different sources of data to find this. Whether if it's in Australia, AIMS have remote sourcing data, NOAA have got lots of buoys around the world. So with sunrise and sunset time, the way the Apex works is you have to put the sunrise and sunset time for the 1st of January, and then the same for the 1st of February. And then presumably there's some algorithm behind here that then incrementally works out that minute change between those two time points. With the lunar cycle, you put in the date at which new moon is happening, and then the moonrise and moon set time is based on the new moon date. So you don't do it for the first of the month, it's based on the new moon. And again, the algorithm just works out that increase and decrease of the lunar cycle in between each one. And so it will take you up to 100% power output and then stagger you down to 0% power output in essence. So this is ultimately what we do with all of the research systems at the Horniman. We're only focusing on Australia and Singapore, and then all of this we sort of taught Kerry how to do, and she's now doing it obviously on Florida, but you can do it anywhere in the world. And potentially, this doesn't just have to apply to corals. This could be used for, I don't know, leafy sea dragons in Australia or temperate systems, whatever it is. And then ultimately, this thing, once you program that in, you can look month by month. Now, this is the old Apex unit, so this was the pre-2016. They've got rid of this functionality. You can't see the full table now. And from a spawning point of view, this is a massive pain in the backside, because this was really useful, particularly around the lunar cycle. So you can see here, can you see my cursor moving around? So in essence, what we're doing when we're spawning, we're looking where that full moon is, and then we're just simply counting the number of days past the full moon when we know each of the corals should be going. And to be able to actually log in month by month and check that the program is doing what you want it to do is a really useful tool. And you can't do this now with the latest version of Apex, which is frustrating. So ultimately what you have to do is just use the timeanddate.com and then just know what sunrise and sunset time should be based on timeanddate.com, and then you almost like hanging out by the system to go, yeah, that's doing what it should do on this day. It's a bit of a pain, but this functionality is really useful for spawning. So this is looking at the temperature data sets from two different systems. So this was the Singapore system, and then this was the Australia system. And it was following around, I think this was from 2015, 16. And you can see, I mean, things like in the Horniman, I mean, it's a single glazed old building that is freezing in winter, boiling in summer. So you can see in the Singapore system here, for instance, it's obviously a very cold evening here at the Horniman, so the heaters have not been able to keep the temperature high. And in the inverse is true for the Australia systems, where the chillers just couldn't keep up with the set points. So you have these random spikes around, but overall it stayed relatively true to that pattern. So that's the temperature. Lunar cycle. Ultimately, what we did with the lunar cycle, at the time I was thinking, the Kelvin temperature of the lunar cycle should be bang on, so we should try and get it as close to 4,120 Kelvin is what I was aiming for. The reality is, they get sold with blue LEDs, so they're in the 20,000 Kelvin range. I just felt like for this initial paper that we should try and at least replicate lunar Kelvin temperature as best we could. So I ended up cutting out all the LEDs and then just soldering my own warm white LEDs, which I think were about 4,500 Kelvin. And then they're very bright, the LEDs on the lunar cycles that come with the Apex. I had this Milwaukee lux meter. It only went to 1 lux, is the sort of finest scale it would go. So basically what I did on a full moon where it's getting 100% power output in these LEDs, I used this lux meter, and then I put a ping pong balls over the LEDs, and then I used bits of white tape to dull the intensity down, so the 100% at power output ultimately hit 1 lux at the surface of the water. And then as soon as I put that probe in the water, basically it couldn't read any lower. So it was kind of a crude way of saying, we know that lunar intensity is about 0.1 lux at full moon, so it's incredibly low output of light. And so I just wanted to, again, make sure that we weren't overpowering the corals with the LEDs that came with the Apex. So again, this was all in going back kind of 5-6 years ago. We've now had coral spawn under the blue LEDs because we basically, these units might have failed. We've just put a standard one on, and we've still had coral spawning, no problem. So again, I think we potentially overthink this whole process a little bit too much. I think ultimately it's presence, absence of light is more important. What we know is that there is definitely gene regulation going on inside the corals in response to this presence, absence of light. So there's been some brilliant studies that have come out over the last few years that's looked at gene regulation in response to corals being allowed to be exposed to normal lunar cycles, and then some that you basically completely black out so they have no Q, or some that you put an LED on all the time to break that Q, and you see a really strong signature in the gene regulation, and then as a result very distinct patterns of spawning behavior. So the ones that have LED lights on all the time, they basically just will not spawn, or you'll have a really low percentage that will spawn. The ones obviously given natural cycles all spawn as they should do. The ones that are kept in dark will spawn, but you start breaking down the synchronicity, and the synchronicity is the key thing. You want all the corals going at the same time, so then you can do the fertilization. So what that tells us is we know that at night you don't want any light pollution buggering up the behavior of the coral. That's really important. So the darkness is as important as the light. And then looking at the photoperiod and the Kelvin temperatures, ultimately what we do is we've created profiles in the apex. So we've got radian sun up, radian midday, and radian sundown, and then programmed in the power output for each of the channels, and then the start intensity and the end intensity. And so this is how we would obviously create the Kelvin temperature of the light, and lots of people work with this. Whether it's the AB plus profile, whatever that is, but this is sort of example from sort of 6 years ago. And then to replicate the photo period, we then use the if sun command, which says look at the seasonal table. So that tells the radion when to turn on and when to turn off. And then with the rad sun up command and rad sun down, rad midday, that gives you the sort of ramping, the flatlining, and ramping down. And so with the rad sun up, we kind of give it a 3-hour ramp up period, flatline it for midday, and then 3 hours ramp down period to try to simulate that rough arc of sun in the sky. And again, it's drawing that data from the seasonal table, which you've programmed in. One of the things that we stumbled across was the Apex only has 2 Wi-Fi channels. So we have 4 systems at the Horniman, and we soon realized that we could only do 2 different photo periods because you basically had to choose which of the Wi-Fi channels you would attach the radions to. So we couldn't do 4 different profiles, because what you'd end up doing is saying system 1 and system 2, you choose Wi-Fi channel 1, and then system 3 and 4, you choose Wi-Fi channel 2. But if you try to program them in a different way, ultimately what would happen is the radions would be jumping from one system to the next, and they would get really confused. Sometimes the radions would be doing disco lights, and so it kind of, that was a massive, or is a massive limitation of the Apex Radion combo for this type of work, I suppose. So the experiments that we've chosen, we've had to choose light as a standard, rather than light being the sort of driving factor, I suppose, of the experiment. All makes sense so far? Yep.
Just to clarify, and you might be getting into this later, but in terms of the moonlight, so you've ruled out the Kelvin of the moonlight is not significant. The color, it's simply the presence or absence of it.
I wouldn't say we've tested this scientifically. What we've seen is we will have blue moonlights on and white lights on a different system, and the corals seem to behave in the same way. But I can't statistically say there's not something going on there.
But from the
scientific kind of
from the experiments you've run, though, you've been able to replicate the results without that being a factor.
Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious.
I mean, it would be great. I mean, there's so much work to pull each one of these facets apart, and there's tons more we need to do to understand this better. But yes, we've had coral spawn under blue LEDs and that come with the Apex units. We've had coral spawn under the white ones. What we do find, and I've got another presentation to show you, is we do find a delay always based on wild. We have a 3 to 4 day delay in spawning, and we don't understand that yet. I think there may be a hormonal cue as a result of that, because I mean, initially we thought it was a light pollution aspect, but we've changed the spawning systems designs over time to make sure we're excluding all external light influences. So we know what they're getting is as natural as it can be. What I feel is, and there's been experiments done looking at how hormones increase in the water column around spawning, and I think they must hit a critical threshold, which then tells that plays a role as well as the environmental cues to say, right, this is the night to go. And I think what happens in our systems is the skimmer is stripping those hormones out, so it may just take a longer time to hit that threshold and kickstart the whole process. I'll show. We did some circular statistics a couple of months back, so I'll get onto this in a minute. And then to replicate this annual solar radiation curve, basically I wanted to factor this in, but there was no way of programming this through the Apex where you could write the code and then just leave it to get on with it. So ultimately the way I got around this was, so you've got A, I think A must be Singapore, and then B is Australia, the Great Barrier Reef. And so this came from, I think it was NASA. You plug in the GPS coordinates, and it will give you 22 years worth of solar radiation data from that GPS. And so I just graphed that out, and then what I ended up doing on the secondary axis is putting in a percentage radion power output. And I kind of did this based on discussions, actually reading a lot of Radion users and stuff like that on your Facebook page, that sort of saying this was going back to the original Gen 2s, but we've used this right the way through on Gen 3s and Gen 4s, saying that a minimum power output we want to work with is 60%, and then taking it up to 100% when we're hitting the full solar radiation curve. With the Gen 4s, what we've done is knocked off, I think, from memory, I think it's 20, possibly 30% on this. And so with the Gen 4s being so much more powerful, we only ever I think we top out at 80%, possibly 70, I can't remember off the top of my head. But we scaled that when we got those in. So the idea is that ultimately you've got the graph or the curve from the kilowatt hours hitting the surface over the months, a secondary x-axis with a radion power output, and then simply each month or each week I then just drew across from the percentage radion axis, and then created this table. So you've got January, week 1, week 2, week 3, and then a percentage power output for Australia. And then ultimately what we did manually is every Wednesday, where we've created the profile, and it's starting off as 0. Let me just zoom in on this. So where the profiles obviously start the day at 0, and then you give an overall percentage. In this example, it says 100%, but this would be sun up. What we would do each week is change it based on what this table was doing. So it was kind of a crude way of creating that curve, but it's sort of staggering its way up and then staggering its way back down. But that's the sort of best, and this is what we still do at the moment, to create that solar radiation curves.
You're not adjusting the spectrum, right? Only the intensity. No. The spectrum remains the same through the entire. Okay, yeah. Perfect.
And again, who knows? That might be an important factor. We just don't know this yet. I think there was a couple of papers. Charlie Bock and Sweeney published 2 papers in sort of the 2010 and 2012, suggesting that twilight spectral changes might be important. I think the data around that was a bit speculative, shall we say. Kerry's just had a paper accepted that she talks about her. So she ultimately used the system design paper that I published and this process, and she's made tweaks to it herself. So she's put in a twilight spectrum in, so once the sun set, and then a slight feathering out of low level of light. And again, I think her data sort of suggests that mucked up the spawning behavior rather than reinforced it. But it's one experiment. We still need to dig into this more to understand it better. What I've not done is put a spectroradiometer on these things and then start playing around with all of that. That's probably the kind of next experiment. So this is all data from that original 2015-16 paper. One thing on the lunar cycle, which is a really nifty function to have. So this experiment was trying to keep everything the same as the wild, and that experiment's done. What is now a really good function is to be able to then muck around with this, based on the experiment might be different. It might be that you just want the corals to spawn, you don't really care how they spawn, you want the material, and then you start the next experiment. And so to be able to change when the lunar cycle sits is really beneficial, and it's beneficial from a working perspective. So as a manager, I have to basically put a staff rotor in place. What I will be doing is looking at when the most staff are in, and I will move the lunar cycle to make sure that the corals move to when I've got the most members of staff in, rather than having to ask members of staff to come in on weekends and all that sort of stuff. That's the functionality that we have now. It's to say, well, we can look now into November, December, and we can say, right, we want the corals to spawn this week, and if we program it in now, by and large, they're going to stay true to the behavior that we want. And that's a really powerful feature, I think, to have, rather than just saying, this is a GBR lunar cycle and you don't have any control over that.